Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to September. I can't believe that it's September already. I hope that everybody is hanging in there with the continued uncertainty that the pandemic has brought. So thank you all so much for joining us and continuing to join us for our webinar series. We hope that you continue to find these updates useful. As always, we are recording the webinar and we will post it to our website after the webinars as soon as we can. We have everybody muted right now to cut down on background noise, but please use the chat box at any time during the webinar to ask your question. If we can, we will answer it in real time, and there's also going to be a question and answer period at the end. And if we don't know the answers off the top of our head, we'll get back to you after the webinar. So just a quick overview of where we're going today. We kind of had our standard introduction, general updates, and our interesting stories. And then we're going to do pretty much just updates of different COVID-19 relief programs coming from the executive orders, the SBA, workplace safety update, the coronavirus food assistance program, and then we're also going to touch on some recent research that Tara Bowling did for the Law Center based on the related to COVID's impact on plastic bans. I saw a few kind of fairly new names logging in. Just a reminder of who we are if you're not familiar. We're based at the University of Mississippi School of Law, and we're here to provide research services to the network. So I encourage you to check out our COVID-19 resources page, as well as all the other resources that are available on our website. Just our standard reminder, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. This is the best way to stay informed with what's happening at the Law Center. We don't have a listserv, so our primary means of disseminating information about our upcoming events and research like blog posts and other publications is through social media. The new information on our resources webpage is, since last webinar, is just the recording and slides from August 19th. But we did have a couple of new blog posts, one related to public health mandates for charter fishing services and vessels. And then there was also some rulings in some efforts to consolidate a bunch of COVID-19 lawsuits into one big package, which was not successful, but those are our recent topics. Just started to kick off our webinars. We thought it would be just to share what we found interesting from the week before. So I've seen more stories about public health officials, cities, and universities using wastewater surveillance to do early detection for COVID-19, and I wanted to mention that about a week ago, well, it might have been August, mid-August, the CDC announced a national wastewater surveillance network for a public health tool. And I know that there are a number of sea grant programs that have been doing water testing, maybe on beaches or working with communities, with respect to water testing and COVID-19. So if your program is involved at all in wastewater surveillance, I'd encourage to learn more about this new CDC surveillance network and see if there are ways to get sea grant data going into that system, or if sea grant programs and their stakeholders could use the data that is in there to inform their decision making. And so this is an emerging tool potentially that can be used to help alert officials of rising cases of COVID-19 through analysis of the wastewater instead of the individuals themselves. And so apparently a couple of universities, including the University of Arizona and University of Utah, have been able to detect possible outbreaks and quarantine students before they actually had symptoms and caused the spread. Turning now more back to the legal side of it, we wanted to spend a little bit of time giving updates on the executive orders that the Trump administration issued in late August. So there was one executive order on unemployment insurance. And so just for a refresher, this provided for an extension of the federal unemployment insurance benefits that expired on July 31st. It directed $44 billion in FEMA disaster relief funds to be converted to provide a $300 federal unemployment insurance benefits. That was meant to then be matched by $100 in state funds for a total of $400, but the state match is not required. And state unemployment insurance filers who would receive less than $100 in benefit are ineligible for this supplement. So the new developments since the previous webinar is just that almost all of the states have decided to move forward in providing this extra unemployment benefit or have already been approved by FEMA to do so. And so this is just a graphic put together by Yahoo Finance that shows the status of these state efforts. One thing to note is that most states have chosen not to match the federal funding. And so most states are only offering $300 and not $400. But you can see there are a few states on there that are suggesting they're moving ahead with $400. Because this was a new program and required states to change their systems, the earliest that payments are likely to start for individual unemployed individuals is late September. So this isn't something that is going to move quickly, and FEMA has suggested that the funding might run out in 3 to 5 weeks. And so this is really just a temporary measure. Another one of the executive orders, which was actually an executive memo related to payroll taxes. And so President Trump signed a memo directing the Treasury Department to defer certain payroll tax obligations. This only applied to employees with taxable wages less than $4,000 per biweekly pay period. One thing to note is that as of right now, any employees deferring obligations from September 1st to December 31st would be expected to pay the deferred amount out of their paychecks in the first quarter of 2021. So this is a pretty risky program for employers to implement because they are the ones responsible for withholding the payroll taxes. President Trump has suggested that he's encouraging Congress to defer the taxes by legislation, and if he's reelected, would seek to make this deferral permanent, but it's not clear that that would happen regardless of the outcome of the election. And so word on the street is that many employers will probably not participate in this program because of the uncertainty about whether the employees would have to repay the deferred amount or pay the deferred amount in the first quarter. But just wanted to let people know, in case you are working with any stakeholders that are businesses that are considering this on, so last week, the Treasury Department and IRS issued a notice with guidance for employers on how to implement this tax deferral. The IRS has also released an updated form in draft form regarding how to report the deferred amount, but additional form instructions haven't been published yet. And as I mentioned, the payroll tax is voluntary and or the deferral is voluntary, and employers have discretion, possibly even on an employee by employee basis, about whether to start withholding. And so there's going to be a lot of diversity, even among within a state, within a local community, about whether employers are actually participating in this program. And so there's a lot of detail related to taxes in this notice that we are not qualified to go into, but encourage you to share this with any of your stakeholders who may be having questions about the payroll tax. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Janessi to talk about the eviction EO.
Yes, so thanks, Steph. So this one relates to providing assistance to renters and homeowners, which was an earlier executive order. And so among other things, that executive order ordered the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the CDC director to consider whether any measures could be taken to temporarily halt residential evictions of any tenants for failure to pay rent in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19 from state to state. So just earlier this week, the CDC issued an eviction moratorium. And so it bars evictions based on inability to pay rent through the end of the year. And the CDC is relying on their quarantine authority to issue this moratorium. The CDC said that the order was necessary in order to stop the spread of the virus, to avoid having renters wind up in shelters or in other crowded living conditions, which would compound the COVID crisis. So it applies to all renters who will make less than $99,000 a year, or $198,000 if filing jointly, or meet some other income criteria to qualify. And so that's significantly more renters than were covered by the CARES Act moratorium, which only applied to renters in apartments and complexes that were financed with federally backed mortgages. So that earlier moratorium, I think, applied to about 12.3 million renters, and this one would apply to 43 million renters. But in order to take advantage of this new moratorium, the renter themselves have to make several adaptations about their current situation. And so they need to state that they've had a substantial loss of household income, they're unable to pay their rent in full, and they've used their best efforts to obtain government assistance to be able to make their rent payments. In addition, they have to say that they've used their best efforts to pay partial rent, and that the eviction would lead to homelessness or living with others in close quarters. But we wanted to note today for you all just exactly what isn't covered by this moratorium. So renters can still be evicted for other reasons, such as criminal activity, damaging property, violating building codes, etc. So it's not a complete moratorium on evictions. The order does not apply in any area with a strong or stronger moratorium that's already in place that's protecting renters. And it also does not apply in American Samoa, interestingly, because they have no COVID-19 cases currently. And then finally, the renters are still going to owe the unpaid rent at the end of the moratorium. So at the end of the year, it is possible that the renters are still going to have a large amount of money that they owe to the landlords and could still face eviction at that time. And so I will segue into our SBA update. And so in the last couple of weeks, the SBA has released a new rule on non-payroll costs. And in particular, it really focuses on some rental and mortgage interest situations and whether those situations are forgivable. So I'm going to go over briefly today just 4 situations: when the borrower has a tenant, when the borrower has a subtenant, shared office spaces, and then home offices. So example 1 is when the borrower has a tenant. So let's say a borrower has a mortgage on an office building it operates out of, and it leases out a portion of the space to other businesses. So the portion of mortgage interest that is eligible for loan forgiveness is limited to the percentage share of the fair market value of the space that is not leased out to other businesses. So let's say that if the lease space represents 25% of the fair market value of the office building, the borrower can only claim forgiveness on 75% of the mortgage interest on their PPP loan forgiveness application. So the second example is when the borrower has a subtenant. So if we say a borrower rents an office building for $10,000 a month, but subleases out a portion of the space to other businesses for $2,500 per month, In that case, only the $7,500 per month is eligible for loan forgiveness. And so they can't claim the entire $10,000, just the portion of rent that they're actually using the space of for their own business. So example 3 is when the borrower shares a rental space. So if we're saying that they share a rented space, the borrower must prorate rent and utility payments in the same manner as on the borrower's 2019 tax filings, or if a new business, the borrower's expected 2020 tax filing. So in this case, it's going off the 2019 tax forms that we've talked about in previous webinars as being the basis for some of these loan forgiveness amounts. And then finally, the last example is when the borrower has a home office. So in this case, the borrower can include only the share of the covered expense, again, that were deductible on the borrower's 2019 tax filings, or if they're a new business, their expected 2020 tax filing. So like the shared space, this is based on whatever the 2019 tax form said, or your expected 2020 tax filings. And that's the end of our SBA update.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. So another thing that we wanted to share with the group today is a new OSHA and FDA checklist for food operations. The full name of this is Employee Health and Food Safety Checklist for Human and Animal Food Operations during the pandemic. It was released on August 11th. It's important to note that this checklist is not a standard or a regulation from these agencies, and it does not create any new legal obligations. But it is like a more condensed form of the existing recommendations regarding the mandatory safety and health standards. And so it's intended to be a tool that can help employers ensure that they are meeting all of the OSHA and food safety standards with respect to their operations. Okay. This is just a screenshot from the purpose. We wanted to point this out because it does reference seafood. And so this guide is intended to be useful to persons growing, harvesting, packing, manufacturing, processing, human and animal food regulated by the FDA, which could include seafood. So if you are working with any fisheries or seafood operations, or actually anyone involved in the processing or production of human or animal food, this checklist could be very useful. There are actually 2 separate checklists in the document. The first part focuses on employee health and social distancing. And so this is a non-exclusive list of the categories, but it talks about facilities, employee exposure and investigation, work environment configuration. And then there's also a section on a food safety checklist, and that includes food safety and a HACCP plan, personnel, suppliers and incoming ingredients, and current good manufacturing practice requirements. And so these are just some screenshots from the checklist, and you can see how it is set up to kind of have these questions that an employer can walk through when they're thinking about their planning with respect to COVID-19. There's also a number of hyperlinks and references that actually go to further information. For instance, have you developed a COVID-19 assessment and control plan as recommended by the CDC and OSHA? That link is going to take you to the guidance for what should be in that plan. And different things like that. And there's also these workplace configuration illustrations and examples in the materials. Now, whether they're practical for fisheries and seafood related facilities, I don't know. They, may have been designed more for meat processing and poultry, and it may not even be practical for those type of facilities, but it's something as a resource that can be provided to stakeholders. And this is just a screenshot from the section that starts with respect to the food safety and HACCP plan, encouraging employers to consider whether there's been any changes to the ingredient suppliers or ingredients with respect to new hazards, any changes to the food products that you've had to make with respect to COVID-19, or changes to operations and processes that might require changes to the procedures or timing of the procedures. And so we didn't have a link in the webinar for that because it was too long, but if you Google FDA, OSHA, employee health, food safety checklist, it will take you to the website where you can download the guide. And so up next is Zach with some CFAP updates.
Thanks, Stephanie. So here are just a couple updates about the USDA's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, which was originally created by the CARES Act. Most importantly, this is going to be the last webinar before the deadline for CFAP applicants, which is September 11th. For those of you who need a reminder of which aquaculture commodities are eligible or how to apply for CFAP aid, you can check out our recording, our last webinar from August 19th, which is called Executive Orders and Other Updates. It's available on the Law Center's COVID-19 resources webpage. With that out of the way, a brief status update, which is that as of August 24th, the USDA has spent $9 billion of the $16 billion that the CARES Act had earmarked for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. This is important for a couple reasons in terms of keeping on our radars. First, assuming that there will be a big flood of applicants towards the back end as we get closer to September 11th, which reflects the later announcements regarding commodities that eventually became eligible, including aquaculture products. That gives us a sense of how much money is still left in the pot there. Looking even more ahead, there's a lot of questions around the future funding of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. The Senate has been negotiating an aid package for COVID and public health related stimulus spending. The last round of negotiations included $20 billion of reauthorization for CFAP, but the talks fell through. This is likely not because of the money that was earmarked for CFAP, but it was a notable stalling of progress and of funding for the program. That being said, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue has announced that he will replenish funds for CFAP with $14 billion that the CARES Act had already earmarked for the Commodity Credit Corporation for after July 1st, if necessary. With that in mind, the bigger picture issues are not going to be so much about whether those funds will be available, but likely how the program, how CFAP can address losses that were incurred by farmers after April 15th, 2020, which was the original date as being important for measuring losses in the CARES Act. So we'll see if maybe the agency tries to use some regulatory creativity, but that may require statutory efforts in order to give the agency more flexibility with paying back farmers or for providing aid to farmers who suffered losses after April 15th. Finally, not that it's a huge deal, but something that people might want to keep on their radars is that Representative Alma Adams, who's a Democrat from North Carolina, recently proposed the Local and Regional Farmer and Market Support Act in the House. This is a bill that targets farmers that CFAP supposedly missed, meaning small-scale, organic, and direct-to-consumer models. One might note that this is a list of markets that are generally considered more premium. there were some claims that premium markets were not adequately compensated, that farmers who market to premium markets were not adequately compensated by CARES Act. This would help address that by basing payments on a farm's historic revenue rather than on the losses that were incurred just between January 15th, 2020 and April 15th, 2020, which, as noted earlier, was the date used for measuring a lot of these losses by the CARES Act. Interestingly, it would also include funds to help pay farmers for public health installations, and also includes targeted assistance to farmers and farming communities of color. What's interesting about this in particular is that despite a lot of what's going on in the headlines, there's actually quite a bit of precedent in agriculture and food bills going back into the 90s that specifically deal with what these bills call socially disadvantaged farmers and farming communities. That is the exact language that this bill borrows from the Farm Bill of 1990. And that is something, potentially that may end up being involved with whatever CFAP reauthorization or regulatory reexamination of the program lies ahead. Most importantly for Sea Grant, however, there is no specific mention of aquaculture in the bill, and we may not end up having to worry about it either way, because an insider from the Hill was reported as saying that it's very likely the bill is going to go anywhere given the gridlock over Congress's higher priorities. This was more so just an interesting highlight of how CFAP might be overlooking some farmers, and potentially might put on your radars the fact that there may be efforts to clean up some of those messes or finally cover some of those missed spots with future legislation.
Great. Thanks, Zach. And we'll turn it over to Tara for our last topic.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the impact on plastic bans that COVID has had. So this summer I did a research project, as Stephanie mentioned, on plastic bans. It was mostly focused on the Great Lakes, but as I was doing the research, I came across several state and local governments that had taken action due to COVID. So citing the risk of the spread of COVID-19 through the use of reusable bags, some of the states or municipalities either temporarily lifted their plastic bag bans that they had in place or completely banned reusable bags. In addition, you may have noticed many retailers prohibited reusable bags in their stores, citing safety of their employees. So at the beginning of the outbreak in early March, the Plastics Industry Association wrote to the U.S. Department of Health and Services, stating that single-use plastics are the most sanitary choice for food consumption. And from there, the movement to ban reusable bags continued to gain traction due to some early studies on the transmission of COVID-19 from surfaces. For example, there was a study by the U.S. National Institute of Health that found that coronavirus can remain on plastics and stainless steel for up to 3 days. There was a CDC study that found it is possible to contract the virus by touching a surface containing COVID-19 and then touching your face or mouth or eyes. So critics of the plastic bag bans kind of use this to argue that the reusable bags have a higher rate of transmission because users tend not to wash them regularly, and they come into contact with cashiers and the conveyor belt and other store products. Since this spring, there have been other experts saying that the chance of transmission through surfaces is pretty low. But at the time in early spring, no one really knew this. So several states and local governments acted based on this reasoning. So just a few examples, like New Hampshire's governor temporarily directed all retailers to use single-use plastic bags and prevented them from using reusable bags. This restriction was lifted in June. And then in Massachusetts, some municipalities there have plastic bag bans, but the governor issued an order in March prohibiting the use of the reusable checkout bags, and then allowing stores to issue paper or plastic bags despite any municipal bans. And that order was also rescinded. That was in June. And then one more example of that is in San Francisco, which was the first city to enact a ban. And they're kind of at the forefront of the movement, but they actually issued an order preventing businesses from allowing customers to bring their own bags or other reusable items from home until May 3rd, 2020. Excuse me. And then it also led to the delay of the implementation of some new plastic bag bans by some states and local governments. So, excuse me. So in Maine, the governor delayed the state's ban on single-use plastic bags from going into effect until January 15th, 2021. The Connecticut governor issued an executive order delaying the implementation of the plastic bag fee through June 30th, 2020. And then in Oregon, it was really interesting. The governor temporarily relaxed its ban on plastic bags because several grocery stores prohibited reusable bags. And then there was a ban on plastic, so the only option was paper. So there was a huge run on the paper bag supply across the state. And so they temporarily lifted that ban. So those are just some of the things that I found as I was working on the report. I can put a link to it in the chat if anyone's interested. It's not primarily focused on COVID, but it was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Tara. Yeah. So if anybody's interested in that report, it is hot off the presses and it is on our website at the link that Tara shared. And so with that, we'll open it up to questions. It's a little bit of a shorter webinar today. We feel like we're throwing so much at everybody all at once. We are always looking for the topics that you have the most need for information on. And so we encourage everyone to reach out to us at any time if you have questions. Questions may be dying down now that the CARES Act programs are starting to kind of fade out, or people are getting kind of comfortable with where they are with their PPP loans and other relief programs. However, if Congress does come back into session in a week or so and enacts legislation that it may revive some of these programs or make some things kind of retroactive depending on what they decide. Of course, I understand that you would have a new kind of flurry of questions, and there hasn't been as much litigation around some of these as you may have anticipated, but we're continuing to track a number of cases involving public access to beaches, mask mandates. There's a variety of things out there. So if you want information about anything, please let us know. We hope that you find this useful, and I don't see any questions coming into the chat box. So I think with that, we'll wrap up. I'll stay on for another minute or so to make sure that we don't have any questions, but I thank everyone again for joining us and have a great rest of the afternoon.